Well, welcome everybody. I'm honored to introduce my friend Cindy tonight. Cindy and I have known each other since elementary school, but I needed a biography from her to know what's going on professionally. So Cindy Clough is an assistant professor of occupational therapy at Mount Mary University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In addition to being an occupational therapist, she has earned a PhD in the social foundations of education. Throughout her 30-plus year career, Cindy has developed an unwavering commitment to building equity and inclusivity for all people who experience social and institutional marginalization. As an occupational therapist, Cindy has worked with individuals who represent a wide range of complex medical conditions and disabling experiences. Cindy continues to teach about and advocate for the inclusion of people with disabilities in all aspects of society.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's my background. I have a PowerPoint and I'm going to share my screen. If you guys who are not showing your faces, it's nice for me to see how people are responding. So if you don't mind turning your videos on, that would be wonderful. But if you don't want to, I understand. Not everybody wants to be seen on the video, but and you can unmute your microphones. It's such a small group that I don't want this to just be like me lecturing at you. I'm totally fine with, like, let me know if you have a question, if you want me to clarify something. And I'll share my screen if I have, okay. Okay, now I'm gonna put this on play. Okay, so the topic here is disability is diversity. And what I'm gonna do is walk through three kind of big concepts in disability. The first one is how we view disability through a medical lens. That is the predominant societal view of disability, and the one that most of us are conditioned to understand. I'm going to talk through different representations of disability that we see in film, in everyday life and experiences, and how those relate to the medical lens. And then I'm going to talk about a social and cultural model of disability, which is really what the disability community at large is promoting. So there's a whole area of scholarship, just like there's women's studies and African American studies and Jewish studies. Disability is an area where there's disability studies, and disability scholars have given us a tremendous amount of literature and work to say how they want to be represented and how they want society to view their experiences. So I'll talk first about the medical lens of disability. This is what will probably seem the most familiar to everybody. The medical model of disability is the presumption that difference or disability is abnormal, it's bad, and it's unfortunate. Years ago, a few decades ago, differences were assumed to need labels. Everything needed to be labeled. If you didn't fit into a bucket of what everybody perceived as normal, as a citizen of society who could contribute great things, then those differences needed to be labeled. And some of the words that I have up here were actual diagnoses that were used when people were admitted to institutions. Sometimes at birth, a baby might have been labeled a moron, and then there was high grade, low grade, feeble-minded, the word retarded, handicapped, even crippled. Those were all medical terms that were used to label disability. Most of those have fallen out of favor. They've been replaced with other terms, but there still persists this need to label difference. And medical professions, I'm an occupational therapist. My profession is founded upon the notion that disability needs to be eradicated or fixed and even cured, and that the goal is to help people become more like the normal population. So this focus on curing, fixing, and managing all aspects of difference is really is a key component of the medical perspective of disability. And that includes differences of the body, differences of how people think and process problem solving, and how people, vision, all the senses, and also the psyche. So how people relate to the world and how their mind processes what we see as reality and not reality. Do you guys know who's in the picture here?
Rosemary Kennedy.
I knew you would know, Beck. So the reason I put this picture of Rosemary Kennedy up here, and I'm sure you've read her story, Beck, she was actually, I mean, some of you probably associate her name like, okay, she's part of the Kennedy family. She had a traumatic birth. She was probably a typically developing infant, but then her birth process, she wasn't let out of the uterus when she was supposed to be. It's a whole long thing, but she was deprived of oxygen. And so she had some mild, what today would be labeled mild cognitive impairments. But the Kennedy family, especially her father, was so embarrassed by her and by the way she couldn't process high-level information, by her social skills, that his whole life was spent on fixing and curing her problems and what he saw as the things that were wrong with her. And he took it to the extreme of having her lobotomized, which was something that was really only afforded to the wealthiest people at the time, but it completely changed her and actually caused her to have significant medical problems and physical disabilities and significant differences in her cognitive and intellectual abilities as a result of that lobotomy. So her whole life was spent with her father trying to make her normal. And what he did was actually made her more different than the general population. So you'll see my references on here. I have references on the last slides at the end if you are interested in looking up any of these sources. The medical model of disability, the goal is to help people who we believe are different approach or become more normal so that non-disabled people can accept them and give them access to all the benefits of society. So anyone who is deemed not capable of becoming normal, this is a picture from Willowbrook Hospital or Willowbrook Institution back in the 40s, 50s. Institutions started the late 1800s and weren't actually dismantled until the 70s and 80s, but they were horrible places. So in essence, in the medical model, we subject people who we perceive as different to a whole host of unusual and abnormal circumstances and interventions. Those might be medical, behavioral, psychotropic, institutionalization, and segregation in our efforts to create a normal life for them. And this room, do you guys know what this might be? A picture of this little space here. These are unfortunately still used in schools today. There's a huge push in the disability community to get rid of these isolation rooms and segregation. But children in public schools, and I've seen it myself when I worked in schools, if their behavior was something that the staff didn't want to or couldn't deal with or had no strategies or skills to de-escalate, they would put them in these isolation rooms. And kids, I mean, this is like solitary confinement. Some kids would be placed in these rooms for a very long time. And I remember one little boy peeing on the walls and picking the paint off the walls, hitting his head. I mean, they're really horrific places. And it's unfortunate that they are still out there and people in the disability community and allies of the disability community are still trying to fight against this. So these are just some things that have been a result of the medicalization of disability. And I'm not saying that all medical interventions are bad, not by any means. If somebody has a seizure disorder, medical intervention is very appropriate. If their hip becomes dislocated because they have cerebral palsy, they may need medical intervention for that. But the overriding medicalization of disability has created a whole host of unfortunate, unusual, and abnormal circumstances, all with the effort of trying to make somebody normal. Some great authors about disability. This is Simi Linton. She was actually able-bodied. She was heading to a Vietnam War protest. She lived in Virginia or somewhere out east, I'm not sure. She was hitchhiking with her husband and another couple to a Vietnam War protest, and they were hit by a car. She's the only one who survived, but she survived with a spinal cord injury. So she was a reluctant disability scholar. Like, that was not her life plan. She knew nothing about disability and the disability rights movement and advocating for access to society and to getting rid of the labels and the stigma. But she was kind of literally thrown into this. She writes in her book, the medicalization of disability casts human variation as deviance from the norm, as a pathological condition, as a deficit, and significantly as an individual burden and personal tragedy. And so she had a lot of experiences where people had the idea that, well, wouldn't it have been better if you hadn't survived? It's, because they saw it as a personal tragedy. And she had to get through that herself, because that was how she was conditioned to see disability at the time that this injury happened. So this is Paul Longmore. You can probably imagine who I'm talking about, the man with the red shirt here. He had polio as a child. He has since passed away, but he's an amazing disability scholar. If you ever get a chance to even just look up YouTube clips where he is teaching about disability. So he was disabled most of his life, but he was a reluctant disability scholar. He really wanted to be a historian. George Washington was his guy, and he wrote a book about him, and that's what he wanted to teach. But he was basically told when he applied for jobs at the university, once he got his master's degree in history, nobody wants to hear from somebody like you. Students aren't going to want to sit in a classroom with somebody like you teaching. So he became a disability scholar as well as a historian. And one of his quotes about the medical model of disability is, it renders disabilities as a series of physiological, psychological, and functional pathologies originating within the bodies of individuals. And this is a really important thing that the disability community continues to teach, is that the medical model situates disability within the person and everything that's wrong with them. And we'll come back to that, and I'll show you how the paradigm shifts when we talk about the social cultural model of disability.
What was his name again?
That's Paul Longmore. And the slides with the references are all at the end. So given this very common idea about disability as this personal tragedy, and the way that disability is commonly represented, I'm going to go through a few images that might be familiar to you and just talk through. I would imagine you recognize these folks. Beck, I know you recognize the Lollipop Kids. But we all grew up with these images, and I fast forwarded here even to Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head from Toy Story 3. So little people who have achondroplasia, which is a medical condition which causes them to have shorter limbs, but there's no, intellectual impairments that are commonly associated, no social impairments, or they're just shorter people. And they can have a whole cascade of medical conditions that are related to achondroplasia, but so often in society, they've not been represented in ways in which they're even human. So these, the Munchkins, that's not like an ethnic group. There's no category of human beings that would be Munchkins or, I forgot who these guys are.
Oompa Loompas.
Oompa Loompas, yeah, that's not even a human category. So, and they're used for entertainment, but it really wasn't until Game of Thrones, and maybe a few roles here and there, but Game of Thrones was probably the first major production where a little person had a starring role, was a main character, won several Oscars for his role, or Emmys, whatever he won. And he was playing a character that was real, and it wasn't about him having achondroplasia. He wasn't the court jester, the fool. He wasn't some inhuman character. He had all the desires and of any other man in his time period, and all the skills and capacities of any other person in that time period. So this up here, if you guys don't know, Mr. Magoo, he was a common cartoon character that I watched growing up. He had visual impairments, so they always showed him with these giant glasses that accentuated the size of his eyes. And the whole point of the cartoon was a comedy sketch. He was always doing foolish things, driving off a cliff, bumping into things, representing blindness and low vision as a comical thing to watch somebody navigate the world without their full visual capacity. He never used a cane. He never had a dog to help him navigate the world. He was just always kind of a fumbling, nice, endearing little man who had low vision. Of course, Dopey, that was another representation of a little person. All the 7 dwarfs were, and Dopey, he is nonverbal, so he has the name Dopey. Like, nonverbal people aren't, it's like this association with you can't speak, so therefore you must have some sort of cognitive impairment. And he's lovable and we all like him, but he was always doing kind of these dopey kinds of things. And of course, now we have, down here, we have Toy Story 3, everybody's got a patch over their eye. So again, there's some sort of visual impairment. And in this scenario, the only times the potato people and the little, I don't know who these little guys are, the little minions here, the only time they have a patch over their eye in the whole film is when they're bandits and they've robbed a bank. So we're representing for children people with a disability or some sort of medical condition as criminals, as the people who are likely to be criminals. And these are just a smattering, just a small sample. We could do a whole class on this. And actually there are whole classes on this. Comedy routines. This picture here is from Chelsea Handler's late night show, Chelsea Lately, which isn't on anymore. But she regularly made fun of, she called him Chewy. I can't imagine that was his real name. But she regularly used him as a source of comedy. And there was a show where she and Rosie O'Donnell went on and on about little people and they're creepy. And can you imagine being intimate with them? That would just creep me out. And I don't like little people. It was quite, it's just very stigmatizing and for little people. This is a comedy sketch on SNL about, I think he was a mayor in New York. I could be wrong about that, but he had a visual impairment. SNL did a sketch about him and made it all kind of like the Mr. Magoo thing. And they ended up apologizing because the disability community and people with blindness were like, this is messed up. And this is Jerry Lewis down here. A lot of his comedy routines were mocking disability. He was everybody loved him at the time. I'm sure people with disabilities saw what he was doing. He is not a friend of the disability community. I could go on and on about that, but even his, rallies for muscular dystrophy, he really patheticized children with disabilities. And many of those people who were used in his fundraising, and charity things were traumatized by the way that they were portrayed to the public as this, you don't want this to happen to your child. Isn't this pathetic? And of course, nobody wants their child to get muscular dystrophy, but it was the way he portrayed them as objects of pity and used, their representation to appeal to people's sympathy to fundraise. Again, whole bunch written about that. Disability as ways to invoke fear and to use as costume and for fun. So I'm sure you recognize some of these characters. Freddy Krueger, I don't know, I've worked with lots of people who have prosthetic hands. I have not yet seen one that's all blades that's used for murder. That is just not a real prosthetic hand. And there are people with hooks for prosthetic hands, and those are incredibly functional. They're not used as much as they used to because technology has, moved on from the traditional hook, but they're very functional. They're better than like people like to see the prosthetic hand that looks like a hand, but those aren't all that useful. And this guy down here, I don't know if you remember this from Silence of the Lambs, like one of the opening scenes. This guy had his face ripped off by, the evil guy who eats people. I can't remember his name.
Hannibal.
Do you know, Beck?
Hannibal Lecter.
Thank you. I'm drawing a blank, but so he was a victim of Hannibal Lecter, and the whole build up to this scene where, is her name Claire? She shows up at his house and she's walking through and he's behind this curtain. It's all meant to invoke fear so that when you see him with his facial disfigurement, you're freaked out and scared. And Freddie as well has this facial disfigurement. Both of these people look a lot like people who've had serious burns or have a skin condition. And so this is used all the time to invoke fear. And it's also used as costume. This one up here really, really irks me badly. This is, Pennhurst was much like Willowbrook. It was an asylum in Pennsylvania, and it was a place of torture and terror for those who were put there against their will, taken from their families without consent, put there as infants. The abuses in institutions were outrageous and tragic, and we don't even really talk about them. We don't know much about them. And for some reason, people have decided that it's okay to turn them into haunted houses for Halloween fun. And then there's actors in there. If you look up Pennhurst Haunted Asylum and their website, there's actors mimicking the nurses and the doctors as these, who worked there, and blood running down them. And then they're mocking the patients as well and traipsing around as if they're like evil patients that went there. When the reality of this is where human beings were put to live and experience horrible tortures and abuses. When I talk about this with my students, especially this time of year, I make the parallel to, is there any other place in society on earth where people have been tortured and abused in horrific ways? And, you can think right away, well, in Nazi Germany. Would we ever think that it would be okay to make a haunted asylum from Auschwitz, the remains of Auschwitz, and then have people dressed up as the people who were there and tortured and abused, and people dressed up as evil guards, and to make it fearful and fun? We would never do this on a southern plantation, take places where slaves were abused and tortured, or people in the Jim Crow South were tortured and abused, and turn these into fun houses and haunted places. So why our society allows this to happen for disability, and to continue to mock disability in this way is just really disturbing to me. So I could go on and on about that, but in the interest of time, we'll keep going forward. So there's also the portrayals of disability as something, people with disabilities are pathetic, they're sad, they're angry. And there's actually a disability website called Better Off Dead, because that is a common theme that people with disability experience, or their family members experience, where people are like, wouldn't you just rather be dead? I mean, there's been whole movies made about that. If you recognize this movie here, this is $1 Million Baby. This is a woman who was a boxer, and she ended up with a high-level spinal cord injury, something like Christopher Reeve's spinal cord injury. And the whole point of the movie, this is a Clint Eastwood film, and he's not a friend of disability either. He never represents disability as something that people can have good, fulfilling lives, and lives filled with love when they're disabled. But that's not the representations that we get from Clint Eastwood. And in this film, if you remember or saw the movie, the whole goal after she becomes disabled is to kill herself by biting off her own tongue. I don't know anybody with a spinal cord injury, and I've met many people with spinal cord injuries. I've worked with them. you know, in the acute phases, and no, but that is not the common theme, that they want to bite off their own tongue so they choke to death and die because they'd be better off dead. This one here, you guys recognize this one? I know you do, Beth. This one in the middle here. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, the two little girls. Do you know who that is?
That's Shirley Temple. Who's with her?
Yeah, I don't know who the actress is. She's playing the role of Heidi.
Oh.
I loved the Heidi story when I was a kid. When I started to understand disability through a different lens, I thought about this movie and this book. And it's like, so this little girl in the wheelchair was the lame child. And it was really portrayed like she just doesn't have the will to walk. If she just had more energy and will, she'd be fine. So Heidi takes her to Grandpa's mountain, and all she needed was mountain air and goat milk, and she was able to walk. Like, that is such a stereotype that if you will it, you can do it. And there are lots of people who won't walk. They'll never have gait and ambulation. And we don't need to like have this idea about them that they just need to go to the mountain with Grandpa and have goat milk, and that'll get them out of that wheelchair. The polio up here in the right corner, the polio era, again, portrayed, I mean, of course, nobody wants polio, but the portrayal, children who, again, like the MD telethon kids, were, when they grew up and realized images of me were used to parents to frighten them and to make them feel like this is the worst thing that could ever happen to your kid, and to instill fear in people. And so that was very damaging and very traumatic for lots of people who were used in that way to incite compassion and fear and pity. They didn't want to be objects of pity. And there's lots of disability writing that uses the word pity. Like, there's a film called Without Pity. There's a site, there's a whole site that has the word pity in it. Well, okay, I don't know. There's a front end word that starts with P on pity. I'll refrain from saying it, but that's like the name of a website that people with disabilities have put out there because of how they feel about being the objects of pity. And so this character here, you guys recognize this guy in the wheelchair in the lower corner, who's actually on his knees?
Isn't that Captain, somebody from Forrest Gump?
Yes, yes. And this is the angry cripple image that is also very common. He came back from the war, and of course he lost his legs, and so it was the 70s and he wasn't treated well in society. And there's this whole angry cripple story with him. And then at the end, he's whole because he has prosthetic legs and he's getting married and he walks up to Forrest Gump at his home. But again, it's that image of, now that I'm walking, I'm whole. And this woman loves me and I can have love when I'm whole. And that's a really common theme with, even in the movie Avatar, when the guy with the disability at the end ends up in the blue avatar body, then he's whole, then he has love, and he'd rather give up his human body to be whole again. And that's not saying that people who experience amputations or spinal cord injuries don't wish that they had their other bodies back, but we have to be careful about presuming that that's all they care about and think about, lots of men who came back from Vietnam, and the Ron Kovic story in Born on the 4th of July, he came back with paralysis. He was more angry about the way he was treated as a veteran and as a person with disabilities than he was about the loss of his functional skills and his mobility and his impairments. And for most people in the disability community, and this is not speaking for all, because there's lots of people who have disabilities or family members with disabilities that don't have this other perspective about disability. So I say that it's not everybody, but when I say the disability community, I'm talking about the people who write the scholarship, who are trying to push for a change in our culture towards disability. they will tell you their biggest problems are the way they are treated in society and the lack of access they have physically and socially to the world than it is their own bodies. This one on the bottom here, the little boy behind the glass, is kind of a common way that people think about autism, like you're trapped, you're in a different world. I always am like, nobody's in a different world. We're all here together. They're not in their own little world. They're experiencing the world that I'm in differently. They might be tuned in to sounds and sensations and experiences that I'm not in tuned to. They're seeing things differently. They're hearing things differently. We can leverage that and see that as a strength. They're tuned into other stuff that I'm not tuned into. That's not a bad thing. So I don't like this idea of they're trapped in their bodies or they're in their own world, or because they're really not. But okay, so then there's also this whole idea of inspiration porn. And there's a link here. I'm not going to do it now because of time, but Stella Young, if you look her up on YouTube, she does this incredible presentation about inspiration porn. And this is taking people with disabilities and using them as a source of inspiration for all the non-disabled people in the world. Like, if she can do this and look at her, then you certainly have nothing to complain about, and you can do this. And really being very patronizing about disability. So the cheerleader dance group at the top, this is so common in public schools, to take all the kids with disabilities and put them in a group. And then any little thing that they do, if they do a somersault, if they jump up and down, people are over the top with their admiration and, oh, it's amazing. Rather than having children with disabilities just be part of the fabric of the normal social system and social environment in a school. And, maybe 2 of these girls would be on the regular cheerleading squad. If the cheerleading squad could diversify and create routines that include people, rather than putting them to their own little group, and then they come out and everybody's like, whoa. One of the things Stella Young talks about in her presentation is how people would be like, so are you going to give us an inspiring speech now? And she's like, no, I don't have an inspirational speech planned for you. I did the same thing this morning you did. I got out of bed, I took a shower, I came to work, I'm doing my thing. Like, that's not inspirational. Just because I happen to use a wheelchair when I do all those things, that's not a source of inspiration for you. So there's kind of this superhuman thing here too with, the people with disabilities, and then there's the whole inspirational stuff, and then the whole patronizing stuff. I have Cody Lee up here from America's Got Talent. I think he had vision impairments, but he also, I believe, had autism. He was a very good singer. As I watched the show, the standing ovations and the kind of over the top, like, wow, you have autism and you can sing? Almost like, that's pretty amazing. And so I don't want to say that it wasn't all sincere, that he wasn't as good and deserving of all that attention, but I often wondered, if he came out an able-bodied person, if his singing skills would have gotten him the same amount of attention as it did, because it was just, I just felt like there was a lot of over-the-top reactions to Cody. And again, I'm not dissing Cody. Okay, so flipping the script here to the social cultural model of disability, I can say I went into my profession of occupational therapy with all of that. I wanted to be the able-bodied savior who helped inspire people with disabilities to have a new life. And, I was inspired by the story, the other side of the mountain, the young woman who got injured in a ski accident. And I was like, I want to help people with disabilities. So, and then I went in the 80s, I went to college, and all of that was reinforced through my medical training. And then I went to get a graduate degree, and I learned about the social cultural model of disability. And I'm like, oh, why didn't anybody teach me this sooner? So in a social cultural model of disability, people with disabilities are telling us They are disabled by the conditions in which they live, work, and play, and not by their bodies, not by their minds, or not by their psyche. So we have this pariah complex of people with disabilities where social attitudes and perceptions discriminate and exclude them. They're too scary looking. They can't be with us. They don't belong here. They don't have the cognitive skills to be with kids their own age. And so we have this, thing where we keep excluding people. People with disabilities live with the constant presumptions of incompetence that create barriers to them pursuing their dreams. So the immediate, oh, he's not going to be able to do that. I got that all the time in the schools. I'd go into a classroom to work with a child with Down syndrome, and the teacher's like, just take him out. He can't do this math. And he's in kindergarten. And it's like, all of these immediate presumptions of incompetence create barriers. And there's lots of people, especially with cerebral palsy, who are capable academically and cognitively of getting master's degrees and PhDs, but because their speech is impaired or because they don't have language, they're nonverbal, they're presumed to not be intelligent. And then they're talked down to, they're talked to as if they're children, the whole thing. There's also barriers in the built environment that present physical access. And I can tell you pretty much everything that's ever been done for people with disabilities has benefited the entire society. Curb cuts were put in for people with disabilities. If you've ever been a mother with a stroller, you've used those curb cuts. If you've ever been on a bicycle or had kids on bicycles on sidewalks, you've used those curb cuts. Even when you watch a baseball game and you see the hand gestures of, of what's happening in the game to the outfield, that was all because of a baseball player who was deaf and how they communicated with him, and it became part of the game. So there's so much that when you go to the gym and you see, and you're on a machine and you are trying to watch the TV and the closed captions come up, that again was for people with hearing impairments. So we're surrounded by stuff that was created for people with disabilities that benefits all of us. The persistent belief in disability as an economic liability. I can't tell you how many times I was on the school board for a while here in my hometown, and there would be people who'd be like, oh, well, if you have to do all that for kids with disabilities, they're not even gonna do anything in life. That's just way too expensive. That takes money away from the other kids who could use it more. So it's kind of the idea that we'll pay for stuff for you after we've given all the non-disabled kids everything they need first. And there's no concept that, it's just the idea that people with disabilities are an economic liability. And that's a really persistent way that we think about disability in society. And then the meritocratic belief that you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You just got to work hard and then you'll get there. But with disabilities, we haven't given people boots or straps. We've actually taken them away and prevented them from getting boots and straps. So the social cultural model redefines disability as a group of individuals who share a common experience of discrimination and oppression in society and engage in collective political action against pervasive cultural devaluation and systematic institutionalized discrimination. So like I said, the cultural disability as a culture group is no different than Jewish studies. It's no different than African American studies. It's again, a group of people who've come together with this common experience of oppression and are taking steps towards collective political action. And there's been some incredible disability movements in this country to get the ADA passed. People with disabilities showed up on the steps of the Capitol, I think it was in the 90s, early 90s, late 80s, I can't remember the year, and ditched their wheelchairs and literally climbed up the Capitol steps because there was no access to the Capitol building. And there's great images. There's images where people in Denver chained themselves to buses because they wanted buses to have disabled access so they could get to the jobs that they wanted to have to be self-sufficient. So incredible movement. Some great quotes that I have pulled from people with disabilities is Norman Kuntz is an adult with cerebral palsy. He has done incredible work on disability. His parents, you know, he was born at a time when most of these kids were put off in institutions, but his parents were like, no, he's living at home with us. And so he has become a strong advocate. He talks about his right to be disabled. Like, I don't have to spend my whole life trying to be normal. Like, this is the way my body works. You're not going to make it normal. And I'm not going to have all these surgeries and therapy to try to fix me. I have the right to be this way. And he talks about, I'm part of the normal diversity of the human community. I'm normal in that I am diverse. So we tend to forget that diversity isn't just about skin color and hair texture and cultural practices around what we eat and how we practice our faith. Diversity is also diversity in the way our bodies are built, the way our bodies look, in the way our minds work, in the way we process information, in the way we relate to one another. All of those are also aspects of diversity. And since man has inhabited the earth, all forms of that diversity has existed. We've just segregated it off and said, we don't value that type of diversity. So he just reminds people that it's normal for me to have a body like this. It's not abnormal. And I want people to see me as just part of the normal diversity of the human community. Paul Longmore talks about how the social cultural model requires us a rethinking of public laws and policies, of social and professional and institutional values. Sorry, you guys, I have to move. Hang on a second here. I can't see all the words on here because you guys are partly over it, but values and practices regarding persons with disabilities, and disability studies has profound implications for research, policymaking, professional practice, and academic inquiry. The whole passing of the ADAs was a decades-long struggle by disability advocates and disability studies to push our government to pass laws that required them to have access. And now it's becoming more commonplace, but there's still a long, long way to go. There's also the human and civil rights aspect of disability. The cultural representation of people with disabilities not only affects our understanding of what it means to be human in more practical terms, it affects public policy, the allocation of social resources, and the meaning of civil rights. And my favorite quote here from Norman Kuntz is, so he talks about how all of the devaluation that he experiences, it makes you feel that you're not quite human, almost like you have to earn your right to be human. In earning your right to be human, what do you get? Human rights. So when you are perceived as less than fully human, what typically are rights for normal people, for non-disabled people, become privileges for people with disabilities. It's like if you have a disability, they believe they're doing you a favor by letting you live in the community. And as soon as I demonstrate that I'm mentally capable, then I have earned my right to be into the community. So he's basically saying, and a lot of people with disabilities have said this, like they're expected to be grateful and thankful that we allow them to have any access at all. If we build a ramp to a building, they're supposed to be grateful for that, when we could just do that on the front end and create access and not expect it, not treat it like it's a favor. It just should be part of the structure of society. And people should not have to earn their right to have access to all the social and all the privileges of our society. So getting real about disability, here are some representations that the disability community has felt very positive about. Christopher Reeve is a little bit of a mixed story because his disability was acquired later in life. He made some great films about disability. He did some great things representing disability. There are still some ways of thinking that weren't fully ingrained in the disability community in the way he talked and presented. And his whole life's work was to cure and fix his disability. But that's not all bad. I mean, it's understandable that he became paralyzed he was probably in his 30s or 40s. I don't even remember his age. It's a different experience than somebody who has cerebral palsy and has always had that disability. So the perspectives are a little different. Do you guys recognize this guy in the middle here, this handsome man in black and white?
Mm-mm.
Do you guys watch Breaking Bad? This guy played the part of the teenage son of Walter White. And he does have cerebral palsy. And his cerebral palsy is not a storyline. And so he helped design his representation of disability in that whole Breaking Bad series. He's just a regular kid. They did bring in a scene where kids were picking on him and making fun of him because of his disability, and that's a real experience that people with disabilities have. So they brought that into it, but it wasn't the storyline. It wasn't the subject of the film, which that's been an unfortunately, we've had representations of disability that have just not been accurate to the real disability experience. This guy down here, this was, what was his name?
Can you talk more about the experiences of people with acquired versus congenital disability?
Yeah, so let me come back to that. Ron Kovic is up there with the American flag. I mentioned him earlier, injured in Vietnam. And then this guy has he was in the film The Mask, where Cher was his mother. I can't remember, he had a condition that created the facial disfigurement. But yeah, I will come back to that in just a minute. There's just a couple more images. So these are veterans. This is a great site. Go to look at It's Not Rude. These portraits of wounded vets are meant to be stared at. It's on NPR. And again, if you look back at the pictures where we incite fear, this is what some of the people look like. And they've been used to incite fear. So when these men go out in public, people are going to respond with fear. We haven't normalized the presence of people who look like this in our public spaces. People are going to respond with shock and horror or disgust and like, I can't look at you. So the photos in this series are meant to be, get used to this. People need to be out in public and have access. So coming back to your comment or your question, it's interesting because within the disability community, there's a whole range of responses to disability, and there's sub-communities. So the deaf community doesn't necessarily, a lot of them don't associate with the disability community at large. They are the deaf community. Autism is becoming an autism community, even though it's under that umbrella of disability. And people, especially men with spinal cord injuries, often segregate themselves into their own community because, well, we don't have cognitive impairments, we just have physical impairments. And so there's athletic programs and sports like murder ball is a sport for people with spinal cord injuries. And then there's the basketball programs and Paralympics. So there are separations within the disability community at large. And so I can't speak for everybody, but there is, people who are born with disabilities and raised with disabilities and who have access to the larger disability community tend to be really strong advocates for all people with disabilities. And they tend to see across all different types. People injured later who acquire disability just have different experiences. They were able-bodied, now they have lost a limb or a couple of limbs or have burns or whatever. So their experiences are different. But then there's also people with physical disfigurement who have different experiences like these men than people with lower extremity amputations, but no physical disfigurement. So there's a lot of subcultures within the disability community itself. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I'm just very struck by how fractured the disability community is, like not even being always getting along among.
Yeah, I don't think they don't get along. I don't know if I describe it as fractured. I don't think it's any different than, like, if you've looked at women's studies or African American studies, there's different frames of thought, different ways of thinking, and different experiences that people have. There's a common thread across the entire disability community of exclusion and segregation and presumptions of incompetence, and there's a common push for access. So it's not like the deaf community doesn't care about the spinal cord injured community or it's not like the spinal cord injured community doesn't care about communities of people with intellectual impairments. It's, there are a lot of common themes, but because of the different, there's even like, so I had this social model of disability in my mind, and there's an author named Tom Shakespeare from Europe, and he's a little person who has undergone, reading and learning all this, I was like, what is my role as an OT then? What am I supposed to be doing? I thought I was supposed to be fixing people. Then Tom Shakespeare came out with this work, and he talked about his frustration with the disability community at large, saying, we can't shut out all medical interventions. He's like, I've had multiple surgeries because I have arthritis, my back was deteriorating, I was having hip problems, and I had physical therapy to help me regain everything that I could so that I wouldn't regress further. So there's this balance. And so it's like any group, like if you look at African American studies, there's, okay, but this is how we talk about racism, but I define it differently than that. And everyone builds on the next. So the work of Tom Shakespeare really hit me in a different way too. I'm like, okay, so it's not about not having any medical interventions, but it's about what is the role of those people providing those interventions and what are the outcomes we're seeking. If I'm working with somebody, I don't look to make them normal. I look to what is it that you want to be able to do that you can, and is there a way we can get you there? And I'm not going to forever work on your range of motion. If you need, we're going to look at adaptive equipment. If it's not an option to get you a physical skill because of your body, then we're going to look at adapting the environment and creating access and advocating. So does that help?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So any other questions? I mean, that's here. I'll go to those. I said I'd mention the slides. If you want to take a picture of the references, you certainly can. This one, the stairs don't go anywhere. That's the Norman Kuntz. It's an interview. That's totally free online. You can go to his website and find that one. And then, yeah, and then here are some other, just the other ones, the National Public Radio one, and then some other books that are.
Hi, I'm Tony. Is there a chance that you could email that to us since you have our emails? Or I noticed you're recording it. Maybe we could get access to that. The organization I work with, Great Bay Services, might be interested in just, there are others that might want to see this, or I would share it online.
Yeah, I wouldn't want you to just post it online, but like you can, if I sent it, yeah, I guess it would depend on what you want to use it for. I mean, I have no problem. Like, do you want the references or you want the whole PowerPoint?
Well, I think the background that everything that you came up leading up to this very part of the presentation was informative to me. I'm a board member of Great Bay Services who cares for developmentally disabled adults.
Okay.
And, there's some background there and some resources that are interesting that might be useful to many. So
you wouldn't just like post it on your website and say because I feel like without the context of hearing about it, it wouldn't be very meaningful to people.
Absolutely, it wouldn't work.
So it would just be for your reference. I can absolutely send you that. Yeah, that's not a problem. I just worry about it just being put out there and then people are like, oh my God, can you believe that she said that? Or why is that on there?
No.
Okay.
And it will be recorded and on the York Public Library's website, the recording will be, our reach hopefully isn't going to get in the way of your reputation, Cindy, but.
No, I'm not as much worried about the my reputation as I am just like the, somebody not understanding it as it's presented, I guess.
Definitely. The internet is not the most generous place, especially in this particular moment. So I completely understand, but we will have the recording up hopefully in the next day or two, Tony, if that's also helpful for your
great, thank you.
For your purposes.
Yeah, and Sophie, I'll just send you a copy of the PowerPoint and then you can share it with the people who are here. And yeah, then the references are there as well. So other questions?
Yeah, what do you hope we do with the information you provided us tonight? You probably know better. You've delivered this before. You've built the presentation. It has a goal or something to take us from one place.
So it's hard because, you know, I teach a whole semester on this topic. So like, this is just like a short 45-minute, 1 hour view of it. My hope is that as you heard this and saw the images and think about how disability is represented, that the next time you see a film or a cartoon or a costume, that you go, wait, that's misrepresenting disability. And that's a representation that harms the disability community. And disability is not a costume. And that you have fresh eyes when you walk around your community and go, if I were a wheelchair user, I wouldn't be able to get in here. How would I order food from that menu if I had a visual impairment? Do they have a audio menu at this establishment? Do they have one in Braille? How do I know the 50 items on the menu if I can't see it? Even this presentation, it's not, you know, will there be, losing the words, where we have the words show up, you know, the closed caption. I actually, as an instructor in occupational therapy, I was just teaching and talking and putting it all out there. And one year, one of my students came and was like, I have a hearing impairment. I'll need everything to have closed captions. And I was like, oh, I never thought about that before. And I work with disability. So we had a place on campus that made everything accessible. And I just had to have everything done 2 weeks earlier so that they could put everything into having closed captions. And I still use those today. And my students still appreciate them, even if they don't have hearing impairments, because it's helpful to them if they can't understand something, especially with all the online instruction. So that would be my goal. I'm glad you asked that question. Like, what is the goal of a 60-minute presentation like this? And it's just to change the way you see things or expand the way you think about disability and access, and it's not as something we need to fix. That it's just a part of life. It's just the way people are, the way we've always been. So, any other thoughts, comments?
I'm Bob Harrington.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Good.
And I'm the guy who's not visually present.
Okay.
You there? Just a name.
Yes, Robert.
And the reason why I'm just a name is because I have, Sophie knows me, and I have some walking problems, and my feet are particularly sore tonight. So I'm laying in bed watching this, and I didn't feel very comfortable laying in bed and being on the screen. So I've got the visual out, but I unmuted so I could participate. But you know, it seems to me that there was, I don't know if I see her here anymore, but there was a nice lady who, here she is in the center, Toby, who made a really good point that it can sometimes seem really fractured in terms of we've got the kids with autism, we've got visual impairment and hearing impairment and so forth, and they all have their needs and have special needs and so forth. And I think what happens is we have these other people who sometimes we call as normal, but they're not normal. I think part of the problem is we want to see, we create this artificial divide where we still are referring to people as normal when that's really an artifact. That's an old term. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there's a dimensionality that we're all on, okay? I mean, I'm red-green colorblind too, 40% of men are. You know, so when I was a kid, the teacher used to say, take out these colors and so forth, but I couldn't ever see them, but I didn't know I was red-green colorblind, and went to parochial schools, and I'd get the Robert, you know, because I'm being obstinate. And I didn't find out that I was red-green colorblind till I was 18, and I went in for a job loading trucks over at the Assembly Mall in Somerville, Mass. The doctor said, well, you're red, green colorblind, just as a matter of fact. And I was like, I am? And I thought, oh, that puts things into perspective. But I guess my point is that I think things get better when we drop out this notion of normal and compare people who are supposedly disabled to normal. And I do like the idea of differently abled, you know, that concept, because you mentioned yourself, Cindy, that sometimes people, we're not going to be able to, quotes, fix them, but we might be able to do something in the environment to modify it structurally, or to teach them how to work in that environment differently so that they can perambulate it better. And that's another way to see it. And what I'm trying to get at is this. There's a book that a student has written, a grad student. It's called Sitting Pretty. Have any of you heard of it?
I think I've heard of it.
Yeah,
I
it
haven't read it. A
kind of
student of mine
happened
told me about it.
recently. She's a grad student at KU. And I say KU casually because I've been a professor there for 40 years. In any case, she wrote this book, and it's about her perceptions of, she's in a wheelchair, of being in a wheelchair, and how she's treated, and all the people. It's kind of a narrative on this, and all case examples. And one person will come up and say, I'm so sorry, and I'll pray for you, and I hope you get better. And, you know, she says, I really resent that, you know, because I'm not religious and I don't want to be prayed for and so forth. Okay. You know, I'm going to just say this. I kind of see disability from the lens of bullying and the lens of tolerance, in the sense that if we would see more tolerance, both sides, people who we might claim as differently abled versus but people who are supposedly normal and they're not really normal either, because they're all different too, but they just don't know it. And I think if we would see it as, okay, they're just trying to get to know me. Case in point, when I was coming out to Boston, my daughter picked me up, and woman was trying to close the door and was closing it on my legs. My daughter said, well, he's got to put his legs in first. And I said, well, it'll be okay. We'll get it done. And the woman was insistent because she wanted to help. I guess my point, I'm going too long, is this. I think if we see what people are trying to do and also understand what their goal is, which is to assist, and they just don't know. And if we then see our opportunity to teach them in that moment, I think that's wonderful. And I think if we also see it as, these aren't bad people. My experience is most of the time, people are really kind, really want to do better. They just don't know how. And I think if we see it as the opportunity, how do we teach them to be different people, more of the type we want? Then I think we can move them versus, gosh darn it, they're not the way they should be. How can they be the way they should be when they don't know what it, where is she again? I think she's moved again. Toby, is she? Yeah, there she is, right? Toby said it's fractured. And there's a lot to know here. You went over an awful lot tonight. And I think it's our job to kind of help them see it and see another way that they can help. And I think that could be helpful. I don't know how that goes over, what people think about that, but
Could I
that's
just,
the way I see it.
comment? If I may, I'm really sensitive to language as my son's advocate. And the word typical or typically developing, it
Yeah,
goes over much better than normal. There's no such thing as really as normal.
I agree.
So if you don't mind my saying that, obviously I've spent a lot of time thinking about this since Miles was born and diagnosed, but
I agree. And that's what I was saying. I don't think there is such a thing as normal.
Yeah, but I'm just being a stickler for the language that we use, as you say, when we're trying to teach others
Yeah.
some of our understanding.
I'd like to respond a little bit to the, I appreciate all that you said, Robert, because I completely agree. Normal is a concept that was made up for the sake of segregating and doing and creating exclusionary practices. We have I use, you know, as an occupational therapist, we use tests to decide who's normal and who's not. We have statistical ways of measuring normal. Normal is socially relevant. Becky knows this because we've been friends forever. If we lived in a society where we literally had to sing for our supper or we wouldn't eat, Becky, I would not have made it past second grade, right? And she would be the one who's still here. So it's normal is a social construct of what we value. And in this society, in our Western culture, and in most cultures around the world, we tend to value able-bodied people who have a typical developmental trajectory and are productive in the way that we think they should be productive, independent, earning a living, all of that kind of stuff. And that is exclusionary to so many people. And as a group, as a culture group, disability is the largest cultural group in the country. There is no group bigger. And every single one of us, born able-bodied or not, can end up in that group of people with disabilities. Every single one of us can easily end up there in a moment or as we age. That isn't true of any other culture group. I'm not going to end up as an African American at any point in the rest of my life. So I'm never going to have those experiences. So there's that piece about normal. And I just caution, Bob, I just want to comment on, you know, using it as an opportunity to teach others. I would caution, I wouldn't want to put the burden of my learning about disability on people with disabilities, unless they've put themselves in a position of wanting to teach me that. Because I have I have many friends who are people of color, and they're exhausted with white people waking up and being like, oh, I'm ready to learn. I get it now. Help me understand. And they're just like kind of fed up. Like, you go do your learning. There's plenty of stuff out there. But you keep burdening me with telling you my stories and reliving my trauma and my frustration when all I want to do, I just want to be a dentist. I just want to go to work every day and fix people's teeth. I don't want to spend my life teaching people what it's like to be in this culture group or this, you know, racial ethnic group. And so I just caution putting too much expectation on people who are living with disabilities to be the teachers of non-disabled people who are waking up to disability and going, yeah, I need to learn about this. Because that might not be what their life's mission is. For some people, it is.
I think that that's true, except that, you know, what I sometimes see, if you read this book, Sitting Pretty, it's pretty militant. And I think you mentioned yourself, there are some groups that are pretty militant. And by being so militant, they kind of segregate themselves out.
I didn't use the word militant, and I would never use that word to describe a group.
Well,
I think they're frustrated and they have, and I think that we need to hear that. People who are not a part of that group need to hear and respect if they're not wanting to be in that position. That's all I'm saying.
I agree with that, except that I think it's a two-way street too. And I think that both behavior is reciprocal and it's a social situation. And I think that people have to be tolerant, they have to be understanding, they have to be empathic. But I think it's also part of society's role to understand, well, what can we do to act in another way? So I think it's a kind of reciprocal thing. I mean, that's the way I see it.
I've been reading an interesting book lately. I'm not sure if you can see terribly well.
Yeah.
This is Susan Weldon, and I've really found her.
Yeah, that looks interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with her already.
No, I haven't seen that one.
She's also a disability activist sort of person, although I suspect she's retired at this point. And well, she's talks about in here a number of the things that you brought up, but one thing that was sort of pertinent is saying, look at the way the world is designed. that particularly our culture, and what a small segment of the population that it's designed for, the young, able-bodied male. And most of us are not young, able-bodied men and never will be. And as you said, most of us will become disabled with age. So why are we designing the world for this small subset of people? Because if we did design it so it was more friendly for people with disabilities, more friendly for elderly people, it would be better for everyone.
And the concept we teach in OT and PT school is universal design. So rather than retrofitting spaces, we design everything on the front end with the most variation of human condition possible. So we don't design a building that you can only enter with steps and then go, oh, now it's finished, where are we going to put the ramp? Or now we got to find a spot for the elevator. We design it on the front end for people with visual impairments, for people with hearing impairments, for people, you know, where every elevator has braille, every floor is marked in a way that people can see it and has access. Because quite frankly, if a person who uses a wheelchair, and I never say wheelchair bound, but if a person who uses a wheelchair as their primary means of mobility has access to everything. If I'm teaching a class on the 8th floor of a building and they can easily get in the front door, they can easily access, you know, the food services on the 1st floor, they can get up to the classroom, they can navigate the classroom, they can go to the bathroom on the same floor that they are in their classes in, they don't have a disability in that point in time. Disability, there's a whole group of people in Europe who, in the US, we often say person first, a person with a disability, a child who has autism. That's common language. But there's a new movement now, and this my understanding is it came out of Europe. We are disabled people, meaning the environment disables us. I am disabled if I ride up in front of a building and there's a set of concrete steps that I can't get in. At that moment, I'm disabled. I'm disabled by the environment. If I come up to a group and they reject me because of the way I look, because I have some facial disfigurement, or, you know, I've been burned by acid or something and I'm scary, I'm disabled in that moment by your social rejection of me. My access to a social group is now limited, and now I carry that trauma with me, so that compounds over time. So the language piece, again, I don't like to think of it as fractured. I don't think it's fractured at all. I think it's evolving, and I think they're all, you know, it's all going towards the same end. But just like any large group of people, there's differences within it, but I wouldn't think of it as fractured. So it's just another way to think about the terminology and the language, and thinking of disabled as something that we do to people, not something that someone is. Disability doesn't reside in their body. It resides in the environment that limits access.
What common end do you see it moving towards?
Well, universal design. I mean, we have a long way to go. I visited Becky out in Maine. We went down to New Hampshire. And as I walked around, I didn't tell you this, Becky, but this is in my brain all the time. I'm walking around like, dang, if I was a wheelchair user, I couldn't get into any of these cool places. You know, the old parts of towns with the brick streets. And I'm like, brick roads are a nightmare if you're a wheelchair user, because they're uneven. And so, you know, I mean, universal design for education, universal design for the built environment, greater acceptance. We've come a long way. We still have a long way to go. When you start really looking around in society and then seeing the different ways people are excluded, you start to realize, I'm a huge advocate for full inclusion in public schools. If it were up to me, I'd get rid of the special education system, and I'd say, if there's 3% of the school population are children with disabilities, then every classroom has 3% of kids with disabilities. Probably higher than that. Maybe it's 20%. But we're not going to have a special ed room down the hallway with 15 kids who are all kids with disabilities. I distribute them across all classrooms, distribute the support services to the classrooms. I've done it with kids with significant disabilities. and it works if it's done right. But typically we see those kids as a liability. They're an academic liability, they're a behavior liability, they're an economic liability. We do it all wrong, but when it's done right, it's the most beautiful thing ever. So that's the end I hope we get to. I'm in Milwaukee, and our beach, our Lake Michigan beach, they just created a ramp that goes from the sidewalk all the way down to the water, so that, because you can't get through the sand in a wheelchair, and they have beach wheelchairs now. So it's the most accessible beach in the country, and it's Lake Michigan. So now they have beach wheelchairs where people can, unfortunately, it was just finished in like early September, right around Labor Day, so we don't get much use out of it yet, but where people can be transferred into the beach chair and taken right into the water, which is so exciting that we finally we thought about people with disabilities on our beach in Milwaukee. And hopefully that kind of stuff it picks up and it takes off, and then other places start doing it. So that's my dream.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for this wonderful presentation. I don't need to cut off questions if there are more, but I also want to be respectful of your time.
Yeah,
and
I want to go watch that debate.
Oh.
And I've already voted, so it doesn't matter. I'm going for entertainment value.
And thanks a lot. This was really, really informative for me.
Welcome.
Thank you, Cindy. Appreciate it.
Yeah, nice to meet you all. And Sophie, I'll send you a copy, and you guys can tap into Sophie for that.
Yes. Yeah. Please let me know if I can connect you with any further resources. And as I said, the recording will hopefully be up, hopefully tomorrow, possibly Monday or Tuesday, depending on how technology worked for me right now. But thank you again, Cindy. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Good thoughts,
Yep.
Toby
Thanks.
and Michelle.